Dead Space is a survival horror game developed by EA Redwood Shores, now Visceral Games, and released in 2008. The game follows the story of Isaac Clarke, an engineer sent to investigate a distress signal from a mining starship, the USG Ishimura. As Isaac arrives at the Ishimura, he finds that the ship has been overrun by grotesque creatures known as necromorphs, the result of an alien artifact known as the Marker. One of the things that made Dead Space so good was its atmosphere. The game setting, a derelict starship, is already creepy on its own, but the developers at Visceral Games took it to the next level with their use of lighting, sound design, and character design. The necromorphs, with their twisted, mutated bodies and disturbing shrieks, are some of the most memorable enemies in gaming. The game's use of a fixed camera perspective also added to the tension, as it often limited the player's field of vision and made it difficult to anticipate when a necromorph would attack. Another aspect of Dead Space that contributed to its success was its combat system. Rather than relying on traditional weapons like guns and knives, Isaac primarily fights the necromorphs with a variety of mining tools repurposed as improvised weapons, like the plasma cutter and ripper. This not only made the combat feel unique, but it also fit in with Isaac's character as an engineer. The game's strategic dismemberment mechanic, which required the player to target specific limbs on the necromorphs in order to take them down, added a layer of strategy to the combat. The story of Dead Space is also worth mentioning. While the game's premise of an alien artifact turning humans into monsters has been done before, the way it was presented in Dead Space was fresh and engaging. The game's protagonist, Isaac Clarke, is a relatable and sympathetic character, and the supporting cast, including the Ishimura's captain, Nicole Brennan, and the game's main antagonist, Kendra Daniels, are well written and fleshed out. The game's plot also does a good job of keeping the player in the dark about what's really going on until the final act, adding to the sense of mystery and horror. The Dead Space franchise is a series of science fiction horror video games, comics, and animated films. It follows the story of Isaac Clarke, an engineer who battles an alien necromorph outbreak on various spacecraft and planets. The sequel, Dead Space 2, was released in 2011. It takes place 3 years after the events of the first game, with Isaac suffering from amnesia and being held in a mental institution on the Sprawl, a city built on a space station. The Marker has once again caused an outbreak of necromorphs, and Isaac must escape the facility and stop the spread of the infection. The third game, Dead Space 3, was released in 2013. It follows Isaac and a soldier named John Carver as they travel to the frozen planet Tau Volantis in an effort to end the necromorph threat once and for all. They discover that the Marker was created by an ancient alien race as a means of achieving immortality, and that the necromorphs are actually reanimated human corpses. The game culminates in a final battle against the alien leader, the Archbishop of the Church of Unitology, who believes that death and rebirth through the Marker is the key to enlightenment. In addition to the main games, the Dead Space franchise also includes several comic books and an animated film, Dead Space: Downfall, which serves as a prequel to the first game. The series has received critical acclaim for its atmosphere, gameplay, and story. 10 facts no one knows about Dead Space game. The development team for Dead Space originally wanted to make a survival horror game set on a spaceship, but the idea was rejected by EA. The team persisted, however, and eventually won the support of EA Executive Vice President Neil Young, who saw the potential in their pitch. The game's protagonist, Isaac Clarke, was named after science fiction writers Isaac Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke. The game's gravity gun was inspired by the Portal gun from Valve's first-person puzzle game, Portal. The game's sound design played a crucial role in creating its atmosphere and tension. The developers used a technique called audio layering, in which multiple sound effects were layered on top of each other to create a sense of depth and immersion. Dead Space was the first game to use the Havoc physics engine for character animation. The game's strategic dismemberment mechanic, in which players had to target specific limbs on enemies to defeat them, was inspired by the film The Thing. The game's story was inspired by the films Alien and Event Horizon, as well as the works of H.P. Lovecraft. The game's necromorph enemies were designed to be disturbing and unsettling, with twisted, grotesque bodies and disturbing sounds. The game's original ending was deemed too bleak and depressing by the development team, so they created a new, more hopeful ending. Dead Space was a commercial and critical success, selling over 2 million copies and receiving numerous awards and accolades. It spawned several sequels and spin-off games, as well as a comic book series and an animated film. Overall, Dead Space is a standout game in the survival horror genre and is still held in high regard by many players and critics. Its atmosphere, combat system, and story all come together to create a memorable and immersive gaming experience.